In January of 1971, Pink Floyd entered EMI Studios in Abbey Road to begin work on what would become their sixth studio album, Meddle. But the only problem was, they didn't have any songs to record. And what followed was countless hours of expensive studio time spent experimenting with sonic ideas only to produce fragments of songs, most of which they never ended up using. But somehow, through all of that, a single piano note led to inspiration. The Making of Meddle tells the story of how Pink Floyd discovered the lyrical motifs and sonic textures that would go on to define their later work, but more importantly, it was on this album where they finally found their identity after the loss of their original band leader. This album would later be seen as the beginning of a new era for the band, one that would see their greatest successes as they would go on to dominate the music charts for the rest of the decade. And so on today's program, we're going to tell the story of how Pink Floyd made Meddle. Alright, in order to tell this story properly, we gotta go back to 1967 and talk about Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd's co-founder and original frontman. He was vital to the band's early success on the charts as he wrote their first two hit singles and the bulk of their debut album. However, when it came time to record their follow-up, he was becoming hard to work with and unreliable due to his declining mental health. It seemed like he couldn't handle the pressures of fame and abused LSD to the point of severely damaging his brain. By December of 1967, guitarist David Gilmour joined the band as a fifth member to cover for Syd during their live shows. Initially, the plan was to keep Syd on as a non-touring member, but this ultimately failed when the band started to realize he was no longer capable of even working with them in the studio. By the end of January 1968, he was out of the group. In the wake of his absence, Pink Floyd struggled with their own identity, and the music that followed would later be seen as a period of experimentation and growth. During this time, they opened themselves up to collaborations and weren't afraid to try anything in the studio. They recorded for 3 movie soundtracks and even started working on music for a new cartoon series titled Rollo. They also released their 4th studio album as a double LP, with the first record consisting of live recordings and the second LP was effectively solo material from each member of the group. One track in particular contains no music, only the voices of David and bassist Roger Waters, plus some tape and sound effects. Also during this time, they started working with a French ballet company to create a series of live performances which would eventually come to fruition in November of 1972. But probably the most important development in Pink Floyd's eventual sound is the title track from their 5th album, 1970's Atom Heart Mother. This song was their most ambitious yet, as it took up the entire first side of the record. It also features a full brass orchestra and choir with arrangements by composer Ron Guesdon, who also co-wrote the song with the band. The idea behind the track was to take the best parts from their extended psychedelic jams like Interstellar Overdrive and Careful With That Axe Eugene and refine them by putting more intention behind the lyrics and arrangements. They were no longer satisfied making songs that just sounded cool. They wanted to give their music more depth in order to emotionally move the listener and take them somewhere. Also from this album is a nearly 5.5-minute song, Fat Old Son, which is a good track on its own, but during their live shows of 1970 and 71, they turned it into an extended jam. It sometimes ran as long as 15 minutes, and the live arrangement contained distinct movements or sections with multiple organ solos. So this live version, along with Atom Heart Mother, had a large impact on what would become their next album. In 1972, drummer Nick Mason said, "I don't think we could have done Meddle without doing Atom Heart Mother." Now, recording for Meddle began in January of 1971 at EMI Studios, and the band would self-produce the record. Most of the sessions began in the afternoon and would last into the early morning of the next day. They were known to enjoy alcohol and partake in marijuana while in the studio, but it was never a party atmosphere. They were there to work. Also in the studio for these sessions was engineer Peter Brown, who worked with the Floyd on their previous record as well as their first, and also on Syd Barrett's second solo album. Also working behind the scenes was tape operator and engineer John Leckie. He also worked on Syd's second album, and he described the band's recording process as, "They were very critical of sound and tuning and what each other was playing. They were always fiddling about with the equipment, trying to make things sound better. Roger and Dave were undoubtedly the leaders. They were the ones who told you what they wanted." Like I mentioned at the top of the video, when Pink Floyd began recording, they didn't have any new material written, but that really wasn't a problem because their record contract gave them unlimited studio time, and in exchange, the band took a smaller percentage of record sales. So this deal effectively gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted in the studio. This freedom allowed them to experiment, make a ton of mistakes, and scrap whole ideas in order to find what really worked. Reflecting back, David said, "Basically, we were the laziest group ever. Other groups would be quite horrified if they saw how we waste our recording time." One of these failed experiments was using everyday household objects to create music. This was something they had played around with on some of their previous songs, including Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast off their last album, but this time they wanted to make a whole record using non-instruments. From what I've read, this was largely the idea of Roger. Keyboardist Richard Wright recalled, "We'd spend days getting a pencil and rubber band till it sounded like a bass. Nick would find saucepans and stuff and then deaden them to try to make them sound exactly like a snare drum." John Leckie elaborated by saying, "They were making chords up from the tapping of beer bottles, tearing newspapers to get a rhythm, and letting off aerosol cans to get a hi-hat sound." They ended up with about 20 minutes of this music before, despite all their efforts, the project was abandoned. One reason was that it would be very difficult to replicate the final product in a live environment, and another reason was it'd be very hard to try to make any of them really work as a piece of genuine music. They did revisit the project a few years later as a potential follow-up to The Dark Side of the Moon, but they ultimately scrapped it again, probably for the same reasons as the first time. This project did inspire the song Money, and they eventually used some of the recordings of wine glasses they made in early January of 1971 on the song Shine On You Crazy Diamond off their 9th album, Wish You Were Here. Also interesting to note is that some of the music for Brain Damage was written during the Meddle sessions, but was shelved until they started working on what would become The Dark Side of the Moon. Another experiment they tried was for each band member to record whatever they wanted on their own without hearing what the other members were doing. Nick said, "We may have agreed on a basic chord structure, but the tempo was random. We simply suggested moods, such as first 2 minutes romantic, next 2 up-tempo, and since they were all playing in the same musical key, the theory was that when they played all 4 tracks together, it should sound like something." However, according to David, the results sounded awful. In 1973, Nick admitted they weren't exactly succeeding experiments, but rather exercises about a particular aspect of music so you could evolve after that. And boy, did they evolve after all of that experimentation. So they started listening back to all these recordings and they started noticing little gems. And so they would name these gems as nothing. So they had nothing 1, nothing 2, and so on. Now, some sources say they had 24 of these nothings, while others say they went all the way up to 36. And one in particular was a single note played on the piano by Richard. So what they had done was mic the piano, then they ran the signal into the Leslie speaker of a Hammond organ. And because the speaker rotates, it creates this really interesting sound, almost like a submarine sonar ping. David recalled it made a strange resonance, kind of a feedback thing, a complete accident. We said, "That's great," and we used it for the start of the piece. Now, the piece he's referring to is the song we now know as Echoes, and Nick said Echoes was a specific attempt to sort of do something by a slightly different method. At the end of January, we listened back and we got 36 different bits and pieces that sometimes cross-related and sometimes didn't. Echoes was made up from that. But more importantly, this song gave them a direction for the album. David later said, "During that whole period through Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother, we were finding ourselves. Echoes was the point at which we found our focus." Now, what's interesting is that John Leckie believes that Roy Harper may have had some influence on the group to make the song. He said, "They shared management with Roy and he was a big mate of the band. He was always around." Now, at the time, Roy had just finished recording at EMI for what is now widely considered his best album, and it features only 4 acoustic guitar-driven tracks, all between 7 and 14 minutes long. The epic storytelling of these songs makes it easy to see how Pink Floyd may have been influenced when writing Echoes. But even with this new direction, Echoes still took some time to get into its finished form. Early working titles for the piece included The Son of Nothing and The Return of the Son of Nothing. By March, the basic backing tracks for the song were captured at EMI, but the recording schedule was sporadic at best. On paper, the album was recorded from January through September, but Pink Floyd was touring all during this time. I mean, they practically went around the world playing Europe, the UK, Japan, and Australia. But this allowed them to test out the new material they were working on, and by April, they were performing an early version of Echoes. However, despite the progress Pink Floyd were making on the song, their record label was concerned that the band was taking too long in the studio and they were losing the momentum they gained from the success of Atom Heart Mother, which had just become their first #1 album in the UK. EMI wanted a new Pink Floyd release before the end of the year, and so they put together a compilation called Relics. The 11-track LP combines their first 2 A-side singles with Syd Barrett, along with some B-sides, several tracks from their first 3 albums, and a previously unreleased song titled Biding My Time. The record was released in May of 1971, and Nick designed the front cover. However, in other countries, including the US and Canada, the cover featured a trippy 4-eyed face, which is actually an antique bottle opener. June and part of July saw the band on their European tour, and when recording picked back up again on July 19th, they had moved to Morgan Studios, which had a 16-track tape machine. Now, these tape recorders were very new for the time and an important development in recording technology. For whatever reason, EMI refused to upgrade their 8-track recorders, and Pink Floyd were growing frustrated with the limitation. You see, what would happen for a band like Pink Floyd is that they would use up all 8 tracks, and if they wanted more, they would have to take a couple of the already recorded tracks and then bounce them, basically combine them into one track on a new tape. This effectively creates a copy of the original tape, but the trade-off is that you lose some audio quality and it can introduce some tape hiss or noise. These new tape machines doubled the amount of tracks available, which gave them more room to add sonic layers while still maintaining high quality audio. By August, the group were on tour again, this time in Japan and then Australia. When they got back home, recording moved again, this time to George Martin's newly opened Air Studios in London, which also had a 16-track tape machine. They would remain at the studio for the rest of the recording of Meddle. As echoes continued to take form, a happy accident happened when David's wah-wah guitar pedal was incorrectly wired from back to front, and it created this really interesting screaming sound reminiscent of seagulls. John Leckie also talks of another interesting recording technique where they use 2 machines, one on each side of the room, run the tape through one, then thread it through the other and record on the first one and play back on the other, so there's this delay. The end of echoes, when the voices swell up, is a snippet of that technique. So based on everything I've read, Echoes was probably the first song they completed for the album. And not only is it a showcase for the band's new musical sound, it's also significant for Roger's new lyrical direction. He was getting bored playing their earlier work on tour, and he was eager to move towards more concrete and grounded songs about the realities of life. Roger was especially inspired by the rawness found on John Lennon's 1970 solo debut, and wanted to try to capture that feeling in his own lyrics. He wanted to move away from what he called their space rock sound and bring them closer to Earth. Now, a prime example of this is the opening line of Echoes. The lyrics for an early version of the song were planets meeting face to face, but as the song evolved, he changed them to overhead the albatross, trading outer space for aquatic space. In a 2004 interview, Roger stated that the lyrics for Echoes were inspired by his disconnection with other people when he first started living in London. From his window every morning, he could see an ant-like procession of people commuting to work, but everyone seemed so cut off from each other despite walking together. Roger summed up the lyrics by saying it's all about making connections with other people, about the potential that human beings have for recognizing each other's humanity. Today, Echoes is widely seen as the beginning of Pink Floyd's most successful period and helped to shape the type of music they are best known for. On the song, they skillfully blended their improvised cosmic live show theatrics and innovative sound textures with poignant lyrics and fantastic melodies. It's highly emotive and expressive, yet it's still grounded and in a way, more accessible to the average listener than some of their previous efforts. But perhaps the most successful aspect of this song was that even though it was spliced together in the mix, it could easily be performed live, which was really important to the band because they made a lot of their money on the road and they wanted to put on a good show. In contrast, they struggled trying to perform the song Atom Heart Mother on tour because of the orchestration and the choir. It was expensive to pay all those extra musicians and it was difficult to mic them properly. They eventually rearranged the piece for just the band, cutting out whole sections before they stopped playing it altogether by May of 1972. And unlike Atom Heart Mother, which opened the album, Echoes was put on the second side, and Nick thinks that's because maybe they were thinking that if they put a more radio-friendly song on side 1, they would have a better chance at getting it played on the air. Coincidentally, One of These Days, which is the first song on side 1 of Meddle, was released as a single in several countries, including the United States, Japan, and Italy, so I think it worked out for them. And speaking of that song, there's not a lot of info regarding when recording started, but most likely parts of it were developed during that initial experimental phase in January. The memorable opening bass line is actually 2 basses played by Roger and David in unison. David said that Roger came up with the thing. I've been playing with a tape delay on my guitar. He decided to try to do the same type of thing as I was doing on the bass, and he came up with that basic sort of riff. David recalls they recorded that double bass part at Morgan Studios, and that one of the basses had really old strings, so they asked a roadie to go fetch some new ones. After waiting for about 3 or 5 hours, they gave up and decided to record the song with the old strings. David says, "You can actually hear it if you listen in stereo. The first bass is me. A bar later, Roger joins in on the other side of the stereo picture." When the roadie did finally return, he said he got stuck in traffic, but since he was wearing different pants, they knew he took a detour at his girlfriend's place. One of These Days is unique in that it's one of the very few, if not the only, Pink Floyd song with a lead vocal performance by Nick Mason. But it's really just one line that's spoken, as the song is mostly an instrumental. He says with a distorted voice, "One of these days I'm going to cut you into little pieces." What they did to achieve this effect was during recording, they ran the tape at a higher speed, and Nick said the line in his falsetto voice. Then when the tape was played back at normal speed, his voice was pitched down and slowed a bit. The line was supposedly a jab at Jimmy Young, a BBC Radio 1 and Radio 2 DJ whom the band disliked because he tended to talk too much. An early version of the song contained a sound collage of him talking, but put together in a way that made him sound like he was speaking in gibberish. At some point, they removed this from the song, but during their concerts in the early to mid-70s, they would sometimes play this sound collage, so in a way, they did end up cutting them into little pieces.
And his own needs starting to get worse. For my husband, unfortunately, I'm the doctor room.
Now, supposedly, elements of the song were inspired by Doctor Who, and at the 3-minute mark, you can faintly hear a not-too-subtle reference to the theme song. Other interesting aspects of the track include cymbal crashes played backwards, and at least one of the basses is being played through a Benson Echo Rec, which is an analog-based echo pedal, which they had used previously on some of their songs over the years. When the album was released, this song inspired filmmaker Ian Eames to make an animated music video. He titled it French Windows, and it features bold colored backgrounds and geometric shapes with rotoscope dancers. It was shown on BBC's Old Grey Whistle Test and caught the attention of the band, who later used his film in concert. Also, in 1974, Pink Floyd commissioned him to make several more animations based on 3 more of their songs from The Dark Side of the Moon. Track 2 on the album is A Pillow of Winds, and the song's title comes from one of the scoring combinations in the Chinese tile game Mahjong, a game they played while on holiday in Saint-Tropez in 1970. This song is notable for Roger's use of a fretless bass and David on slide guitar. This, along with the next track, were the first songs co-written solely by David and Roger since their 1968 song Point Me at the Sky. Track 3 is Fearless, and the title comes from an expression in the world of football, also known to us Yanks as soccer. Basically, Fearless means awesome, and they doubled down on the football theme by having the fans of the Liverpool Football Club singing the team's anthem, You'll Never Walk Alone. The chant was recorded live at a match between Liverpool and Everton. It appears briefly at the beginning, in the middle, and most clearly at the end of the song. But the strange part is that no one in the group was a fan of Liverpool, so why did they do this? According to Richard, he said, "We featured the Liverpool supporters because they're the best football crowd in the country for what we wanted." What's also interesting is that Pink Floyd enjoyed playing football so much they even had their own informal club called the First 11. It featured the band plus their manager Steve O'Rourke, their road managers, roadies, as well as Storm Thorgensen. The next track, Saint-Tropez, was written solely by Roger and was inspired by a mini vacation they took in the south of France in 1970. This is also where they started playing Mahjong. Roger brought in the song ready to go, and it's speculated that this was the final song recorded for the album. Supposedly, it was put to tape quickly because they were under some pressure to have the album ready for the Christmas holiday shopping season. The track also features a piano solo by Richard, and David contributes a slide guitar solo. And fun fact, when the album came out in Italy, many people misheard some of the lyrics because of the way Roger slurred the words together. He actually sings "Making a Date Later" by phone, but Italians thought he was saying "Making a Date for Rita Pavone."
Making a date for later by phone.
Now, Rita is a well-known 60s pop singer in Italy, and even she thought Roger was singing about her. Now, while the song's jazzy style might sound out of place on this record, when you look at their catalog as a whole, many of their previous albums feature songs that could be considered silly or out of place, and Saint-Tropez is nothing compared to the final song on side 1, Seamus. Now, this is credited to all 4 members and was mostly improvised in the studio. David plays harmonica and sings, but the real star of the show is Seamus the dog. The border collie belonged to Humble Pie's frontman Steve Marriott, and he had taught Seamus to howl whenever music was played. David was dog-sitting Seamus while Steve was touring in America, and he would sometimes bring the dog into the studio, and one day he told the other members that Seamus could sing. Roger recalls, as soon as the dog hears a harmonica, it starts howling, so we all thought we'd do a short 12 bar and stick him on it. David later said, "I guess it wasn't really as funny to everyone else as it was to us." They would later perform this song for their Live at Pompeii film, and they named it Mademoiselle Knobs after the dog they got to be on camera. It's worth pointing out how they would later revisit this idea to some extent on their song Dogs off their 1977 album Animals. As Meddle was nearing completion in early August, the band took off for their first tours of Japan and Australia. And while they were down under, they met with filmmaker and surfer George Greeno, who showed them some early footage of a surfing documentary he was working on called Crystal Voyager. They were very impressed with the incredible footage of waves crashing and the POV shots captured by strapping a camera to his body. They eventually gave him permission to use their song Echoes in the film, and in return, Pink Floyd used some of the film footage for their live shows starting in 1974 and continued to use them all the way into their 1994 Division Bell tour. And while the band was still in Asia, either in Japan or on a layover in Hong Kong, they had a phone meeting with Storm Thorgerson about the album art for Meddle. Now, Storm was one half of the design collective named Hypnosis, and they had designed several of the Floyd's previous albums, including the striking cover for Atom Heart Mother. Now, Storm's idea for the cover was to have a close-up photo of a baboon's anus, but the band swiftly rejected this concept and instead requested a photo of an ear underwater. When Hypnosis set out to actually create the image the band wanted, they decided it would be best to create 2 separate images and superimpose them together. Supposedly, the ear belonged to a woman who worked in their office, and the water ripples were made in a brightly lit tray of water. Both images were taken on a large format film camera in a 5:4 aspect ratio. They hired Robert Dowling to take the photos since he was well versed in that camera format. Incidentally, Robert would later go on to create the cover image for their 1987 album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. And speaking of which, that was the first Pink Floyd album since Meddle to feature a photo of the band as part of the album art. For the inside gatefold image of Meddle, Hypnosis is credited with taking the photograph. For the 1994 CD remaster booklet, Storm created additional underwater scenes using the same water ripple photo superimposed on top of objects relating to the lyrics. For Storm, Meddle's cover is his least favorite of all of Pink Floyd's albums. He said, "The band always say that Atom Heart Mother was a better cover than it was an album, but I think Meddle is a much better album than its cover." His partner at Hypnosis, Aubrey Powell, agreed, saying, "The cover has an abstract element to it, but I don't think it works as a piece of art. Personally, I've always loved the cover of Meddle, and I thought it always looked like a surrealistic camel, but sure, compared to their other albums, I can see their point." Now, as for the album's title, I wish I could tell you it has some deep meaning for the band, but in all my research, I couldn't find a single quote from them talking about the origin of the name. In the book Saucerful of Secrets says that the title was most likely brainstormed during their stay at a Japanese hotel room. Maybe this was around the same time they pitched their Ear Underwater album cover idea over the phone, but we won't really know. I did find an interview with the band from August 15th while they were still in Australia, and the interviewer asked them what the album was going to be called.
What's this called?
That's a matter of some dispute. We don't know.
Now, Storm offers his own theory in that it had something to do with the fact that the band took their wives on that Japanese and Australian tour, and their presence meant that the band couldn't meddle with other women while on tour. So I think you can kind of connect the dots there. At this point, though, the truth is probably lost to time, so we are left to interpretations. Now, obviously the title can be seen as a play on words, medal as in an award or an achievement, but the literal meaning of the title is to mess with something. Someone on Reddit said that sound waves can be seen as disturbances, and so if we look at the cover art, you can see an ear underwater with these ripples, and so you could interpret this to mean that sound waves are meddling with the water, which fits really nicely with the song Echoes and its aquatic lyrics and Sonar Ping opening. It also sounds similar to the word mettle, as in mental toughness or fortitude. And as I've already shown, this album took a lot of determination and resolve to complete, so perhaps they were thinking of that when they named the record. But getting back to the story, by the 21st of September 1971, Meddle was complete and entered the final mixing stage at Command Studios in London. And by October 4th, the band were in Pompeii gearing up for a new concert movie directed by Adrian Maben. His idea was to make an anti-Woodstock film, basically make a band movie with no audience, and so he filmed Pink Floyd over 4 days in the ruins of a Roman amphitheater. Additional performances were filmed in Paris in December of 1971, with even more footage shot in early 1973 while the band was working on what would become The Dark Side of the Moon. The finished film features 3 songs from the album, Seamus, One of These Days, and Echoes, which is split into 2 parts to bookend the film. It premiered at the Edinburgh Film Festival in the summer of '72, but it wouldn't be released to the general public until 1974. In 2025, a newly restored version of the film with a new sound mix was released in theaters and on home video. Meddle was released on the 5th of November 1971, and contemporary reviews were mostly positive, with many outlets rightly praising the brilliance of Echoes. However, in his review for Melody Maker magazine, Michael Watts called it Pink's muddled metal. He even said One of These Days was a throwback to Telstar by the Tornadoes. He somewhat praised Echoes for its concept, but felt the track overall lacked any real depth. About a month later in December, he received a package at his office, and he thought it was a thank you gift from a record label. When he opened it, a spring-loaded boxing glove shot out, nearly hitting his face. It turns out it was an early Christmas present from Pink Floyd. Now, Meddle didn't sell as well as their last album, only reaching number 3 on the UK charts, and it was less popular in the US, only climbing to number 70. Capitol Records was partly to blame for not giving the album enough promotion, but despite what sales figures might say, this became one of their most important works because it represents an evolution in their sound. Meddle is the point at which the band really started to mature, come into their own, and their creative dynamic began to coalesce. It shows them falling out of love with what David called the psychedelic noodling of their output after Sid's departure. They took what they loved about their earlier work, added in more recent studio experimentations, and refined it by embracing a more structured approach. For example, a song like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun would largely be improvised to the point that no 2 live performances were the same, whereas Echoes is remarkably consistent from the album recording to the live versions. The contributions from Nick and Richard are excellent and consistent as ever, but probably the most defining elements of this record are the use of melody and lyrics, crucial components that were lacking from their work after Sid's departure. Now, a large part of this was David finally feeling comfortable within the group and asserting himself. He became much more confident in guitar as well as lead vocals, and when you look back at their earlier albums, his presence is there, but it's not as strong. On this album especially, he began to take on a leadership role and proved to be very instrumental in shaping the melodic sense of this album and their later work. The other large component was Roger, maybe for the first time, really exercising his gift of lyrics. Their output after Sid and before Meddle doesn't feature a lot of words. It's mostly instrumentals, and if there are lyrics, they're not really consequential to the music. They're more like a texture. But on Meddle is when Roger gets to the truth, or close to the truth that he wants to speak, and that's why this record is so important for the band's development. You could say that everything leading up to this record was them learning how to speak, and on Meddle is when they knew what they wanted to say. Even so, this is an uneven album. It's a step in the right direction with the other foot stuck in the past. Echoes is a standout song on here, but there's also some really beautiful work on side 1, especially with the way tracks 1, 2, and 3 flow beautifully together. That being said, there's a little bit of filler with Tropez and Seamus. I don't think they take away from this record, it's just evidence that they hadn't quite escaped their past. In hindsight, Roger seems to agree, as he said, Atom Heart, Mother, and Meddle are half good. I like Atom Heart, Mother, and Echoes themselves, but we made a right mess of it on the other sides. Looking back, Nick said, making the album was very satisfying, and this was the first time they worked together as a band in the studio since A Saucer Full of Secrets. Richard said they were all encouraging each other, all getting inspired by other people's ideas, and it was a really collective piece of music. David said, Meddle is amongst my favorites. I mean, that to me is the start of the path forward for Pink Floyd. It's the point where it all started falling into place. The Echoes piece itself going through all sorts of different moments, all of which are really good. That was leading the way towards the dark side of the moon. And David wasn't joking. On the reprise of Breathe, you can hear a melody that's strikingly similar to the opening line of Echoes.
Far away across the field, overhead the albatross.
Countless others were also inspired by Echoes, including Andrew Lloyd Webber, who may have copied a large part of it for his theme song to the Phantom of the Opera. In fact, Roger was pretty pissed when he first heard the song, but decided life's too short to take any legal action. One of These Days was also highly influential, most likely inspiring their own song Sheep off their 1977 album Animals. It's also easy to hear how Brian Eno may have been influenced for his 1974 song Third Uncle. And Depeche Mode was also inspired when making their own song Clean from 1990. And so that is the story of Meddle, a record born out of nothing that sent them down a path of incredible fame and fortune. Now, if you're looking to pick up a copy on vinyl, it's relatively easy to come by and inexpensive as it was reissued a bunch over the years, but probably the most valuable copy is the transparent blue Colombian pressing from 1982. And the second most valuable is the 1984 Mo-Fi edition that's half-speed mastered and pressed in Japan. Other notable copies include the Japanese red vinyl edition with a special narrow red obi strip, the Spanish pressing with a kind of horror movie poster-inspired text on the front, the Israeli pressing that used the back cover as the front cover for its non-gatefold pressing, and finally in 2016 it was remastered for vinyl, and according to reviews on Discogs, it's a great pressing, so you got a lot of options. My personal copy is an original 1971 pressing from France. Alright everyone, that will do it for today. Be sure to let me know what new facts you learned from this video, and while you're at it, let me know your favorite track off the album with a comment down below. Now, if you want to learn more facts about this era of Pink Floyd, be sure to check out my video on the making of their Live at Pompeii film when it becomes available. You can also check out my video on the dark side of the rainbow, and in it I touch on the phenomenon of how Echoes syncs up with the final 23 minutes of the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's pretty crazy. Until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.